The Mountain That Watches, the Lost Thorne Expedition, and the Vitrified Peaks Anomaly. Have you ever stood at the foot of a mountain and felt watched? Not by an animal in the brush or another hiker in the distance, but by the mountain itself, as if the sheer, ancient mass of rock and ice possessed a form of consciousness, one that is vast, patient, and utterly indifferent to your fleeting existence. Most people dismiss it. A trick of the light, the wind playing strange notes through the canyons, the disorienting effects of altitude. But in certain, isolated corners of our world, the whispers of the wind carry stories. Stories that caution us. Stories that serve as a protocol for survival in a wilderness that is far older and far stranger than we can comprehend. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol. Today, we are opening a file on a phenomenon that blurs the line between geology and folklore, between science and a type of horror that has no name. We're going to a remote, unnamed range, a place cartographers have marked, but few have ever dared to tread. The locals, the few who live in the shadowed valleys below, call them the Glass Mountains. The official designation in our files is the Vitrified Peaks Anomaly. They say the strange, glass-like sand on the mountain peaks is the remains of something that fell from the sky, long ago. They also say that those who go looking for it never come back quite the same. This is the story of what happens when that protocol is broken. This is the story of the Thorne Expedition. Have you ever stood at the foot of a mountain and felt watched? Not by an animal in the brush or another hiker in the distance, but by the mountain itself, as if the sheer, ancient mass of rock and ice possessed a form of consciousness, one that is vast, patient, and utterly indifferent to your fleeting existence. Most people dismiss it. A trick of the light, the wind playing strange notes through the canyons, the disorienting effects of altitude. But in certain, isolated corners of our world, the whispers of the wind carry stories. Stories that caution us. Stories that serve as a protocol for survival in a wilderness that is far older and far stranger than we can comprehend. Welcome to the Wilderness Protocol. Today, we are opening a file on a phenomenon that blurs the line between geology and folklore, between science and a type of horror that has no name. We're going to a remote, unnamed range, a place cartographers have marked but few have ever dared to tread. The locals, the few who live in the shadowed valleys below, call them the Glass Mountains. The official designation in our files is the Vitrified Peaks Anomaly. They say the strange, glass-like sand on the mountain peaks is the remains of something that fell from the sky, long ago. They also say that those who go looking for it never come back quite the same. This is the story of what happens when that protocol is broken. This is the story of the Thorne Expedition. Before we can begin to dissect the chilling final days of the Thorne Expedition, we must first lay the groundwork. We must travel back in time, not through years, but through layers of story. Because the tragedy that unfolded in 2018 was not a beginning. It was an echo, an inevitable conclusion to a story that began long before any of its victims were even born. To understand their fate, you must first understand the mountain's memory. What is a story when it ceases to be entertainment? When it is no longer told to pass the time, but to preserve a life? In the sparse, wind-scoured valleys that crouch beneath the vitrified peaks, stories are not fables. They are operational procedures. They are the collected data of generations who have learned a terrible truth through trial and, more often than not, through error. The central narrative, the one from which all others branch, is that of the star that fell. Now, when we, in our modern world, hear such a phrase, our minds immediately conjure the image of a meteorite. A silent, fiery rock arcing across the night sky, ending its journey in a plume of dust and a newly formed crater. A violent, but ultimately sterile, geological event. This is not what the stories describe. The elders, who pass the tale down in hushed, reverent tones, are very specific in their language. They say the star was not silent. They say it screamed as it fell. They describe a sound that tore through the fabric of the sky, a sound that was not the physics of friction and atmospheric compression, but the pure, unadulterated sound of agony, a shriek of a consciousness being rent apart. They say it did not strike the earth in a single, solid impact. It was already broken as it fell, and upon striking the highest, granite-crowned peak of the range, it did not create a crater. It shattered. Imagine a crystal goblet, infinitely complex and impossibly vast, struck by a hammer. The resulting explosion was not one of fire and rock, but of light and sound and something else. An essence. This crystalline remnant of a shattered being, rained down upon the three highest peaks. The sheer, otherworldly energy of the event did not merely scatter debris. It fundamentally altered the mountain itself. The impact flash melted the native granite, instantly vitrifying it, transforming solid stone into a fine, black, glassy sand that coats the peaks to this day. A sand that, when the sun strikes it just right, glitters with a cold, unnatural light. For centuries, this story was enough. It was the foundation of the local protocol, an unwritten law more binding than any government mandate. You do not climb the high peaks. You do not seek the glitter. You do not listen too closely to the strange, high-pitched music the wind makes when it blows across the summits. You respect the mountain's wound, and you leave it alone. This sacred boundary remained uncrossed by outsiders for generations. The mountains were too remote, too treacherous, and offered no obvious reward. Until the early 20th century. Until the arrival of men with a different kind of a faith in dynamite, steel, and the promise of gold. Until the arrival of a man named Silas Kane. The official records on Silas Kane are thin. He appears in the 1920 census as a prospector, age 42, with no listed family. Town elders from the period, interviewed decades later for a regional history project, described him as a man made of the same hard material he sought. He was tall, gaunt, and weathered, with a disposition hardened by solitude and driven by a singular, glittering avarice. He was not a man for small talk or superstition. He was a man of rock and shovels and quantifiable results. When he arrived in the frontier settlement of Havenwood, a place that was little more than a muddy street, a trading post, and a saloon, he heard the local tales of the Glass Mountains. He heard them from the bartender, from the worried-looking indigenous men who came to trade furs, from the postmaster. And he laughed. To a man like Silas, these stories were transparent. They were primitive fictions designed for a single purpose, to frighten away competition. A glittering mountain? To Silas Kane, that meant only one thing. It meant quartz deposits. It meant mica. It meant the potential for a motherlode of gold so rich the locals would invent any ghost story necessary to keep it for themselves. He saw their caution not as wisdom, but as a poorly disguised map to treasure. In the spring of 1928, ignoring the quiet pleas and solemn headshakes of the townspeople, Silas Kane packed his mule, loaded his supplies for a month-long expedition, and set off towards the peaks. He was a confident, determined figure silhouetted against the dawn, marching towards what he believed was his fortune. He was gone for not 1 month, but 2. As the weeks bled into a second month, the people of Havenwood assumed the mountain had claimed him, as it had a handful of others who had underestimated its brutal weather and treacherous slopes. He was written off as another fool who had paid the ultimate price for his greed. Then, one evening, as a cold autumn rain turned the street to mud, the doors to the saloon creaked open. A figure stood there, framed in the doorway, dripping water and silence onto the floorboards. It took the patrons a long moment to recognize him. It was Silas Kane, but it was not the same man who had left. The man who had marched into the wilderness was wiry and full of a restless, sharp-edged energy. The man who returned was hollowed out. His clothes were in tatters. He was emaciated, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His once neat beard was now a long, wild tangle, matted with mud, and something that glittered darkly even in the dim lantern light. But the most profound change was in his eyes. The sharp, assessing flint of the prospector was gone, replaced by a vacant, 1,000-yard stare, as if he were perpetually gazing at a horizon no one else could see. He stumbled to the bar and collapsed onto a stool. The bartender, a man named Jedediah, cautiously slid a glass of whiskey towards him. Silas stared at it, unblinking. He didn't speak. He couldn't. When Jedediah asked him what had happened, where he had been, Silas simply opened his mouth and began to hum. It was not a tune. It was a single, low-frequency monotone. A resonant, deeply unsettling sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but in the listener's teeth, in the wood of the floor, in the very marrow of their bones. It was a sound devoid of all emotion, a sound of pure, mechanical vibration. His mule was found outside. Its saddlebags, which should have been heavy with her samples or, if he'd been lucky, with gold, were instead filled to bursting with something else. Pounds and pounds of the fine, black, glass-like sand. He had found no fortune. He had brought back only the mountain's strange, sterile dust. Silas Kane never spoke a coherent word again. He sold the few possessions he had, cashed in a small claim he owned in another territory, and used the money to purchase a secluded plot of land deep in the valley, a plot where the glittering peaks were in constant, clear view. And there, he began to build. Using river stone, fallen timber, and a strange, dark mortar he created by mixing the glassy sand with mud and water, he worked tirelessly. The townspeople watched from a distance, a mixture of pity and a growing, primal fear coloring their view. He wasn't building a cabin, or a barn, or anything recognizable. He was erecting bizarre, alien sculptures. He built spires that twisted towards the sky at angles that seemed to defy gravity. He constructed arches that led to nowhere, framing only the empty sky. He raised walls that intersected in ways that felt fundamentally wrong to the human eye, creating non-Euclidean shapes that gave onlookers a sense of vertigo and nausea just by looking at them. It was as if he were trying to replicate a form of architecture from a place with different physical laws. Night after night, the low, monotonous humming would drift down from his property, and soon, it was accompanied by a new phenomenon. Lights, faint at first, then growing in intensity. Strange, pulsing, kaleidoscopic lights would flicker between the bizarre structures, casting shifting, geometric shadows across the valley floor. It was a silent, lonely, and deeply disturbing spectacle. This went on for 3 years. The humming man and his impossible architecture became a dark fixture of the local landscape, a constant, unsettling reminder of the mountain's power. Then, one autumn morning in 1931, the valley felt different. It was quieter. The humming had stopped. That night, for the first time in years, the hillside where Silas lived was completely dark. After a week of this profound and unnerving silence, the town sheriff, a pragmatic and fearless man named Arthur Miller, gathered a small posse to investigate. They found the property abandoned. The half-finished sculptures stood like skeletal remains against the sky. The makeshift hut Silas had lived in was empty, save for a bed of straw and several sacks filled with more of the black sand. Silas Kane was gone. He had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. But the feeling on the land remained. In his official report, a copy of which is now stored in our archives, Sheriff Miller wrote in detail about the experience of walking amongst the structures. He described it not as fear, but as a profound sensory violation. He wrote, "Standing between the stone pillars caused an immediate and severe vertigo. The very space between the objects felt warped, as if the air itself was bent. Looking at the angles for more than a few moments induced a blinding headache and a sense of deep, existential dread, a feeling that I was a foreign object in a place not meant for me." 2 of his deputies suffered severe nosebleeds and had to retreat. Miller himself said he felt a pressure building behind his eyes so intense that he had to crawl out of the area on his hands and knees to escape it. His final recommendation in the report was stark and unequivocal. He ordered the structures to be demolished, lest they continue to impose their wrongness upon the landscape. The men hired for the demolition work were paid a premium. They used dynamite. Even so, they reported suffering from debilitating migraines, disorientation, and nightmares for weeks afterward. The strange glass sand, the catalyst for it all, was carefully collected by order of the sheriff. The report concludes that it was sealed within a lead-lined box and buried in an undisclosed, consecrated location. The disappearance of Silas Kane and the disturbing legacy he left behind cemented the local folklore into an unbreakable protocol. It was no longer just a story about a fallen star. It was now a documented case study, a warning with a name and a face. For 90 years, that protocol held. The Vitrified Peaks remained a glittering, silent anomaly on the edge of the map, a place known only by its chilling reputation, a place left alone. Until Dr. Thorne, a man who believed all legends were simply puzzles waiting for a brilliant mind to solve them, discovered a footnote in an old geological survey that mentioned an unexplained vitrification of granite. Until he decided he was the man to solve the riddle of the Glass Mountains. For nearly a century, the story of Silas Kane served as an effective quarantine. It was a mimetic barrier, a tale so unsettling that it insulated the Vitrified Peaks from the relentless curiosity of the modern world. The mountains remained a silent, glittering enigma. But the 21st century has a unique form of arrogance, a belief that data can demystify any ghost, that science can illuminate any shadow. It was an arrogance perfectly embodied by one man, Dr. Thorne. To understand Thorne is to understand the seductive power of intellect. He was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man deeply in love with the universe, but he saw it not as a poet does, but as a master mechanic sees a complex engine. To him, every mystery, every anomaly, every whisper of the supernatural was simply a mislabeled component, a system whose schematics had not yet been deciphered. He was a charismatic, celebrated, and pathologically ambitious geologist and planetary scientist at a prestigious East Coast university. In academic circles, his name was synonymous with groundbreaking, if sometimes controversial, research. He didn't just think outside the box. He fundamentally believed the box did not exist. His discovery of the Vitrified Peaks was, like many great and terrible discoveries, a matter of pure serendipity. He was in the university's deep archives, researching a paper on fulguritous glassy tubes formed when lightning strikes sand or rock. He was looking for extreme examples, outliers that could challenge existing models of atmospheric discharge. Deep within the unindexed appendices of a forgotten geological survey from the 1950s, he found a single, tantalizing sentence. It was a footnote to a map of the unnamed range, citing an even older, more obscure municipal report. It read, "Anomalous vitrification of granite substrate at high altitude, approximate 9,000 feet. Local lore suggests meteoric origin, but no impact crater is present. See Havenwood County Sheriff's Report, 1931, Re. S. Kane." For anyone else, this might have been a curious but ultimately trivial footnote. For Thorne, it was the lighting of a fuse. He hunted down Sheriff Miller's report. He read the account of Silas Kane, the strange humming, the non-Euclidean structures, the lead-line box. And where others saw a chilling tale of madness and supernatural dread, Thorne saw something else entirely. He saw data points being misinterpreted by a pre-scientific mind. The humming? Auditory pareidolia, perhaps, or tinnitus from an explosive pressure event. The warped space? Vertigo from altitude and malnutrition. The glass sand? That was the prize. A massive lightning strike was possible, but the lack of a singular point of impact was puzzling. This led into a more thrilling hypothesis, a unique meteorite, one that didn't impact but exploded in the air, an airburst event showering the peaks with superheated, exotic material. A discovery of that magnitude wouldn't just be a paper. It would be a legacy. With the fire of discovery burning in him, Thorne did what he did best. He secured funding. He crafted a proposal so compelling, so filled with the promise of prestige and groundbreaking science that the university's grant committee eagerly signed off. He was assembling an expedition, not to conquer a mountain, but to dissect a myth. And for that, he needed a team. A small, elite, and specialized team. His first choice was Dr. Lena Petrova. Lena was an astrobiologist, a scientist whose field exists on the very edge of the known. While Thorne looked at rocks and saw history, Lena looked at them and saw potential. The potential for life, or the chemical precursors to it. She was as brilliant as Thorne, but her brilliance was tempered by a deep sense of caution and wonder. Where Eris saw a problem to be solved, Lena saw a mystery to be respected. She was the expedition's intellectual and moral counterbalance. Her job was to perform the delicate analysis, to search the glass sand for biosignatures, extremophiles, or any organic compounds that would prove Thorne's theory of an extraterrestrial origin. She read the old stories of the star that fell, and, unlike Thorne, she felt a prickle of profound unease, a sense that the folklore might contain a different kind of truth. The second member was the team's engine, Ben Carter. Ben was a gifted doctoral candidate in engineering and geophysics, and he was the expedition's technology guru. He was young, brilliant, and possessed an unshakable, almost religious faith in the power of data. His world was one of sensors, spectrometers, ground-penetrating radar, and high-resolution drones. For Ben, this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to work alongside his idol, Dr. Thorne, on a project that felt like something out of a science fiction novel. He was the embodiment of youthful optimism and technological certainty. He believed that if there was an answer to be found on that mountain, his equipment would find it, translate it into clean, quantifiable data, and solve the puzzle. The concept of a mystery that could not be measured was alien to him. With the science and tech team in place, Thorne needed one final, crucial component, a guide. Someone who knew the treacherous terrain, the unpredictable weather, the soul of that specific wilderness. This proved to be the most difficult part of his planning. He arrived in Haven-Woodno, a slightly larger, but still isolated, town a month before the expedition, expecting to easily hire an experienced mountaineer. He was met with a wall of silence. The money he offered, which was substantial, was met with polite but firm refusals. The story of Silas Kane was no longer a ghost story. It was local history, and the protocol it had established was deeply ingrained. One old man at the town's small diner simply pointed a gnarled finger out the window towards the distant, glittering peaks and said, "Some doors ain't meant to be knocked on, mister." Eventually, after a week of searching, he was directed to one man, Calen Vance. Cale was a man who lived on the scene between two worlds. He was a former park ranger and search and rescue professional, intimately familiar with modern navigation, survival techniques, and emergency medicine. He was pragmatic, physically capable, and respected for his knowledge of the wilderness. But he was also of local indigenous heritage. He had not simply heard the stories of the star that fell, he had grown up inside them. They were part of his cultural DNA. He didn't speak of the mountain with fear, but with a kind of solemn, heavy respect, the way one might speak of a sleeping giant or a sacred burial ground. Thorne met Cale at his small, neat cabin at the very edge of the valley. He laid out his maps, his plans, his scientific objectives. Cale listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask of granite. When Thorne was finished with his enthusiastic pitch, Cale was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I will guide you," he said, much to Thorne's relief. Then came the conditions. "I will take you and your team to the tree line, to the place where the old forest ends. We can establish a base camp there. That is a safe place. But I will go no further. Not one step. The high peaks are not for us. That is my price, and it is not negotiable." Thorne, ever the pragmatist, readily agreed. All he needed was a guide to the mountain's base. His team could handle the ascent. He saw Cale's stipulation as a quaint, harmless adherence to local custom. He failed to recognize it for what it was, the first and most important layer of the protocol. In the crisp air of early October 2018, the Thorne expedition officially began. Their convoy of specialized, all-terrain vehicles, loaded with gleaming cases of expensive scientific equipment, looked like a small-scale Martian invasion force parked at the trailhead. They were a perfect microcosm of modernity, confident, equipped, and utterly certain of their ability to master the natural world. As the team began the meticulous process of unpacking and cataloging their gear, Cale Vance stood apart, his gaze fixed on the three distant, shimmering peaks. He watched as Thorne excitedly calibrated the flight path for a drone, as Ben checked the signal strength on a satellite phone. He then walked over to Lena, who was methodically double-checking their advanced medical kits. "You feel it, don't you?" Cale's voice was low, not meant for the others. Lena paused, zipping up a pouch of sutures. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Feel what? The cold? The altitude is already getting to me a bit." Cale slowly shook his head, his dark eyes never leaving the summits. "No. The quiet. It's an empty quiet up there. Listen." Lena stopped and listened. And she understood. It wasn't just quiet. It was a void. There were no birds. The usual chatter of squirrels and small forest creatures was absent. It was as if a line had been drawn across the landscape, a line that life instinctively knew not to cross. The animals don't go past the treeline, Kale continued, his voice barely a whisper. They know. That is not a place of life. It's a place where something ended. A place of profound wrongness. You should tell your doctor, he said, gesturing with his chin towards the oblivious Thorne. To be careful what he's looking for. In my people's stories, there is a lesson. Sometimes, finding something is a far greater tragedy than finding nothing at all. A chill, entirely separate from the mountain air, traced its way down Lena Petrova's spine. She looked at the absolute, unshakable certainty in Kale's eyes. This was not the rambling of a superstitious old man. It was a warning, a diagnostic observation from a man who had been collecting data his entire life, data of a different kind. It was a protocol. And as she watched Eris Thorne laugh, clapping Ben on the back as they looked at a sensor readout, she felt a sudden, sickening sense of dread. She was part of an expedition that was marching, with scientific precision, directly into the heart of a story it refused to read, to break a protocol it did not even have the wisdom to understand. The farewell at the base camp was cordial, yet underscored by a palpable tension. Cale Vance watched as the three scientists shouldered their advanced, lightweight packs. He gave Lena a small, almost imperceptible note of final, silent gesture of caution. Eris Thorne, brimming with the energy of a conqueror on the verge of claiming new territory, offered Cale a hearty handshake. We'll be back in 72 hours with the discovery of the century, he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the unervingly still air. Cale did not smile. He simply watched them turn and begin their trek, three bright, modern figures shrinking against the immense, ancient grayness of the mountain. He watched until they disappeared beyond the first ridge, and then he settled in for his long, lonely vigil. The ascent from the treeline was a journey into another world. The transition was not gradual. It was stark and unsettling. One moment, they were in the domain of life, surrounded by the hardy, wind-stunted pines and the muted greens of alpine moss. The next, they crossed an invisible boundary. The trees ceased to exist. The moss vanished. The very color seemed to drain from the world, leaving only a monochrome palette of granite gray and sky blue. As Cale had warned, the silence was absolute. It was not a peaceful, meditative silence. It was a sterile, vacuum-like emptiness, the sound of a place that life itself had abandoned. Ben, ever the enthusiast, deployed their first drone from a stable rock outcropping. The small quadcopter rose with a high-pitched whinny and insectal, mechanical sound that felt like a profanity in the profound stillness. On his ruggedized tablet, a crystal-clear, 4K image materialized, fed from the drone's camera as it soared ahead towards the first and lowest of the three target peaks. The footage was breathtaking and deeply alien. It confirmed the old stories with a stark, high-definition reality. The entire upper cone of the mountain, from about 1,000 feet below the summit, was coated in a fine, uniform layer of black dust. In the unfiltered, high-altitude sunlight, it didn't just glitter, it seemed to absorb the light and re-emit it with a million pinpricks of cold, sharp brilliance. It looked less like a geological feature and more like a deliberate, artistic choice, a mountain draped in a mantle of crushed black diamonds. Incredible, Thorne breathed, his face hovering inches from the tablet screen, his eyes wide with vindication. Look at the uniformity, the sheer scale of it. The coverage is far more extensive than I ever imagined. I'm getting some very strange readings, Eris, Ben said, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tapped through different data overlays. The electromagnetic field up there is fluctuating. It's not the steady background radiation you'd expect. It's pulsing, very faint, but it's a structured pulse. It's not natural. He switched screens. And the preliminary spectrometer data from the drone sensor is, well, it's going haywire. The primary composition is exactly what you'd expect from vitrified granite. High concentrations of silica, iron, feldspar. But there are trace elements here, isotopes that my library can't identify. The signature is off the charts. It's exotic. The word hung in the air. Exotic. It was the word Thorne had been dreaming of. He slapped Ben on the back, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face. Exotic. I knew it. This is no lightning strike. Lena, do you hear that? This is it. The smoking gun. This is contact in mineral form. Lena, however, did not share his elation. She stared at the drone footage, at the stark, beautiful, and fundamentally wrong landscape. It didn't look like a discovery. It looked like a crime scene. A place of immense, ancient violence. The glittering peak didn't seem like a treasure trove. It seemed like a tombstone. The sense of unease she had felt in the valley was now crystallizing into a cold, hard knot of dread in her stomach. It took another 4 hours of grueling climbing, the air growing thinner with every step, their labored breath sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. Finally, they reached it. The threshold. It was a line as clear and defined as a tide mark on a beach. One foot stood on familiar, rough-hewn granite. A single step forward, and the ground beneath their boots changed. The sound was the first shock. It wasn't the soft, abrasive crunch of sand. It was a sharp, crystalline shearing sound. A high-pitched, glassy protest with every footfall. SHHH. It was the sound of walking on finely ground shards. They stopped, standing in a stunned silence, taking in the scene. The black sand stretched out before them, covering the entire slope in a gentle, rolling blanket. It was finer than beach sand, almost like a powder, yet each individual particle was a microscopic, razor-sharp piece of obsidian-like glass. It caught the harsh sunlight in a way that created a bizarre optical illusion, making the ground seem to shift and shimmer, as if it were not entirely solid. It was a landscape from a dream, beautiful, majestic, and suffused with a sense of deep and profound wrongness. Okay, team. Protocol. Thorne's voice, sharp and businesslike, broke the spell. His professionalism, however, could not mask the tremor of pure excitement within it. Full sample containment procedures. Let's not contaminate the find of a lifetime. Gloves, masks, hermetically sealed containers. Ben, get the atmospheric sensors deployed and running. I want a full profile. I want to know if this stuff is off-gassing anything at all. Lena, prepare the portable microscopic analysis kit. I want to see this stuff up close right now. They moved with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned field team. Thorne and Lena, clad in their protective gear, knelt and began carefully scooping samples of the black sand into sterile, labeled containers. Each scoop produced that same, unsettling, glassy whisper. Ben set up his instrument tripod, a small array of sensors and antennae that began their silent, digital interrogation of the alien environment. The first 10 minutes were a model of scientific procedure. And then, the protocol was broken. It was Ben. He was adjusting a low-profile atmospheric sensor, kneeling close to a small, smooth drift of the black sand. He finished his adjustment and then just paused. He stared down at the sand, his head cocked. The way the light refracted through the countless tiny particles seemed to have mesmerized him. It was like a miniature galaxy at his fingertips, a billion black stars shimmering with captured light. Through their short-range comm system, Lena and Thorne heard him whisper, a soft, awe-filled sound. It's like looking into a field of stars. It was a moment of pure, human wonder. And it led to a moment of pure, human folly. Perhaps it was the altitude impairing his judgment. Perhaps it was the boyish curiosity that had driven him to science in the first place. Or perhaps, as Lena would later speculate in her haunted recollections, it was something else. A subtle, silent persuasion emanating from the sand itself. A whisper that bypassed the ears and went straight to the mind. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up with his left hand and peeled off his thick, insulated right glove. Lena saw the movement from the corner of her eye. Her reaction was instant and sharp. Ben, what are you doing? Glove on. Now. That's a direct order. Just for a second, he murmured, his voice distant, his eyes still fixed on the sand, glazed over. I just want to feel it. Before Thorne could add his own angry reprimand, Ben Carter plunged his bare right hand deep into the drift of black, glassy sand. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and yanked his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. It's sharp. He shook his hand, examining his palm. Of course it's sharp, you idiot. It's pulverized glass. Thorne barked, his voice a mixture of anger and concern. Get your glove back on. Did you cut yourself? Let me see. No, I'm fine. Ben said quickly, a little too quickly. He hurriedly pulled the glove back on, hiding his hand from view. No cuts. I'm fine. But his expression was strange. He stood up, staring at his newly gloved hand, flexing the fingers as if it were foreign to him. It's cold, he said, his voice quiet and strange. It's not mountain cold. Not from the temperature. It feels empty. The incident was over in less than 30 seconds. A minor breach of protocol. A moment of reckless foolishness. That's how Thorne logged it in his mind. He gave Ben a stern lecture, and they returned to their work. But a threshold had been crossed. A connection had been made. The sterile barrier between the observer and the observed had been violated. A microscopic shard of that alien, shattered thing, or perhaps just the information it contained, was now under Ben's skin. The whisper from the star that fell, silent for uncounted millennia, had found a new receiver. Ben Carter, the expedition's bright and eager tech specialist, was now patient zero. He went back to his instruments, his movements now a fraction slower, more deliberate. And under his breath, so quietly that it was completely masked by the thin, high-altitude wind, he began to hum. It was a low, resonant, and deeply unsettling monotone. The very same sound that had once echoed from the lonely, madness-infused cabin of Silas Kane, 90 years before. In epidemiology, there is a concept known as the incubation period. It is the silent, deceptive interval between an organism's exposure to a pathogen and the first visible manifestation of symptoms. For Ben Carter, the incubation period was terrifyingly brief. The contagion he had contracted on the glittering slopes of the Vitrified peak was not biological. It did not attack his cells. It attacked his consciousness. And its first symptom was silence. The change in Ben was not a sudden, dramatic shift. It was an insidious erosion of self, a subtle fading of the bright, enthusiastic young man who had begun the ascent just hours before. At first, Eris and Lena attributed it to the obvious culprits: exhaustion from the climb, the disorienting effects of high altitude. The first night, they established a small, efficient camp amidst the black sand, their two specialized sub-zero tints looking like fragile, brightly colored shells on the shore of a dark, alien sea. The world outside their thin nylon walls was one of profound silence and piercing cold, under a black sky so clear and star-dusted it felt infinite and crushing. It was Lena who first registered that something was fundamentally wrong. She was jolted from a shallow, restless sleep in the dead of night. It was not a sound that woke her, but a feeling. A distinct, physical pressure inside her skull, a low-frequency, vibratory thrum that seemed to be resonating deep behind her eyes. It was accompanied by the lingering images of a deeply disturbing dream. In the dream, she was not herself. She was bodiless, floating in an absolute void of perfect blackness. Around her, colossal geometric shapes made of pure, incandescent light pulsed and rotated in a silent, complex ballet. They shifted through a spectrum of colors her waking mind could not name, forming a symphony of impossible architecture. But the dream was not peaceful. It was suffused with an emotion so vast and overwhelming it had no human equivalent, a cosmic loneliness, the agony of a single, unified consciousness that had been violently shattered into an infinity of disconnected fragments, each one screaming in silence across the void. She woke with a strangled gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom thrum still echoing in her head like the ghost of a struck bell. The next morning, the change in Ben was more pronounced. The garrulous, tech-obsessed young man was gone, replaced by a quiet, withdrawn figure who moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion. He avoided eye contact, his gaze constantly fixed on the screen of his data tablet. When Lena, concerned, asked if he'd slept well, he offered only a curt nod, his eyes never leaving the screen. It was then that she noticed his other hand. On a small, waterproof notepad beside him, he was sketching. She leaned over, feigning interest in his data. The page was filled with intricate, twisting shapes. Spires that spiraled at impossible angles. Arches that intersected in ways that defied perspective. Complex, crystalline lattices that seemed to mock the laws of Euclidean geometry. They were the very same structures she had seen in her dream. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, seized her. "What are you drawing, Ben?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost trembling. He looked up, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, his eyes were not his own. They were unfocused, looking through her, as if at something far away. The moment passed, and he blinked, a flicker of the old Ben returning. "Oh, adjust patterns," he mumbled, his voice flat. "In the data, the EM fluctuations. They form patterns. Everywhere." He quickly flipped the notepad shut, a gesture that was both defensive and secretive. Thorne, however, was blissfully, dangerously oblivious. He had slept the sleep of a man on the verge of ultimate triumph. He emerged from his tent holding a sheaf of printouts, his face alight with an almost manic glee. The initial data sets were more spectacular than he could have ever dared to hope. "Lena, look at this," he exclaimed, his voice booming in the thin air. He held up a printout of a waveform analysis. The EM signal isn't noise. It's a complex, repeating pattern. It's structured. It's too ordered to be a natural phenomenon. This isn't just a rock. This is a message. A beacon. A memory crystal. A piece of alien technology that has been sitting here, waiting for eons. We're not just rewriting the geology books. We're rewriting the very history of life in the universe. Lena tore her eyes away from Ben, trying to force her concerns into a logical framework that Eris would understand. "Eris, something is wrong with Ben," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And I had a very strange dream. I think this place, the sand, it's affecting us neurologically." Thorne waved a dismissive hand, his focus entirely on his data. "It's the altitude, Lena. Hypoxia. It's known to cause vivid dreams, auditory hallucinations, even paranoia. Ben is exhausted. We all are. It's to be expected. Let's stay focused on the science. Don't let Kale's campfire stories get into your head. The answers are here." He tapped the printout in the data. Not in ghost stories. But the ghost stories were beginning to bleed into their reality. Throughout the second day on the peak, the strangeness escalated, becoming impossible to ignore. The auditory phenomena became more frequent and were experienced by all three of them. A faint, crystalline ringing sound, like the chiming of 1,000 microscopic tuning forks, would fade in and out of their perception. They would all stop what they were doing, looking at each other. "Did you hear that?" Thorne would ask, a flicker of annoyance on his face. Lena and Ben would both nod. Their sophisticated, hardened equipment began to malfunction in inexplicable ways. The GPS unit, which connected to a dozen satellites, would drift, placing their position hundreds of yards away before snapping back. Their digital chronometers, synchronized to an atomic clock, would lose or gain several seconds at a time. Ben's drone, on a survey flight to map the slope of the second, higher peak, suddenly went haywire. Its controls became unresponsive, and its video feed dissolved into a cascade of kaleidoscopic static before cutting out completely. They watched helplessly as the expensive piece of equipment veered sharply and plummeted into a deep, inaccessible crevasse. Ben's reaction was the most disturbing part. There was no frustration at losing the drone, no anger at the equipment failure. He simply watched it disappear and said, his voice placid and detached, "It's okay. It's where it needs to be now." That night, the humming returned. It was louder now, clearly audible. After their meager evening meal, Ben didn't retreat to his tent. He sat on a rock facing the second, taller peak, the source of the strongest EM signals. He sat perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening intently to a conversation no one else could hear. And from his chest came the low, monotonous hum, a constant, vibrational presence that permeated the entire campsite. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical sensation. Lena felt it in her jaw, a sympathetic vibration that made her teeth ache. It was the sound of a human body being used as a resonating chamber. Unable to sleep, her mind racing, Lena found Eris in the main equipment tent. He was hunched over his computer, completely absorbed, the complex waveform of the anomalous signal scrolling across the screen. The pattern was intricate, hypnotic, and in the dim light of the tent, terrifyingly beautiful. "Eris, we have to talk," she said, her voice firm, cutting through his concentration. "This is not altitude sickness. This is not paranoia." Ben is humming, and his hum is on the exact same low frequency as the primary EM signal you're tracking. "Look," she pointed to the screen, then to the silent, humming figure of Ben visible through the tent flap. "Don't you see? It's not the sand that's broadcasting anymore. It's him." He touched it. The information, the pattern, it's inside him somehow. It's a contagion. For the first time since their ascent, a shadow of genuine doubt crossed Thorne's face. The comfortable wall of his scientific certainty was beginning to crack. He looked from the elegant, alien data on his screen to the unsettling spectacle of his student, humming in the dark. "A biological agent," he murmured, thinking out loud. "A prion? A microbe?" No, the atmospheric scans were completely sterile. No nanites, no engineered viruses. "It's not biological, Eris," Lena insisted, her voice rising, cracking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "It's informational. It's a mimetic virus, encoded in the crystalline structure of the sand. Think about the story of Silas Kane." He hummed. "He built those bizarre, non-Euclidean structures. Ben is drawing them. The sand isn't just a material, Eris. It's a blueprint. It's a consciousness, a shattered one, like in my dream, and it's trying to rebuild itself. It's using whatever raw materials are available. 90 years ago, it was wood and stone. Now it's Ben's mind." The full, terrifying weight of her words finally seemed to break through his intellectual defenses. He stared at the data on his screen, but his expression had changed. He was no longer looking with the eyes of a triumphant scientist, but with the dawning, abject horror of a man who has just realized he has picked a lock that was designed to protect him. The elegant, complex pattern wasn't a beacon. It was a thought. He hadn't been observing a piece of inert alien technology. He had been eavesdropping on the fractured, dreaming mind of an alien god. As this cataclysmic realization settled upon him, a new sound cut through the cold night air. It came from Ben. He had stopped humming. Now he was speaking. But the words were not from any human language. They were a flowing, articulate cascade of clicking, sibilant, and guttural phonemes, structured in a syntax that seemed to twist the human tongue into impossible shapes. It was a language that had never before been spoken on the planet Earth. As he spoke this alien tongue, he rose slowly to his feet. With the unnerving, steady gait of a sleepwalker, he began to walk away from the camp, up the shimmering black slope, towards the second, taller peak, towards the epicenter of the signal. The contagion was no longer incubating. It had become active. It had a purpose, and it was calling its host home. The moment Ben Carter began to speak in that impossible language, the sterile, academic environment of the expedition vaporized. It was replaced by a raw, primal fear, the kind our distant ancestors felt when the thing in the dark finally stepped into the firelight. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the camp. Thorne and Lena scrambled out of the equipment tent, their powerful LED headlamps cutting frantic, bouncing beams across the abyssal darkness of the glass sand slope. Ben was already 100 yards away, a small, dark silhouette moving with the unnerving, metronomic certainty of a puppet. The stream of alien phonemes flowing from him didn't falter. It was a constant, articulate broadcast into the silent night. "Ben, stop. Ben, that's an order," Thorne yelled. His voice, usually so commanding, was now thin and reedy, swallowed by the immense, indifferent space. The figure did not slow. It did not turn. It simply continued its steady, inexorable ascent. "We have to get him. He'll freeze to death out there," Lena cried, pulling on her heavy parka, her movements clumsy with adrenaline. "No, wait," Thorne said, his voice a strange mixture of terror and a horrifying, lingering curiosity. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His face, starkly illuminated by the beam of his headlamp, was a mask of conflict. The scientist in him, the man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of the unknown, was warring with the basic human instinct for survival. What if this is it? Lena. The breakthrough. True first contact. He's not being controlled. He's a conduit. He's translating. He's a puppet, Eris. Lena screamed, wrenching her arm from his grasp with a desperate strength. The last vestiges of her professional deference were gone, burned away by sheer terror. And that thing is pulling his strings. We need to get off this mountain. Now. We have to call Kale. We have to abort the mission. But the mountain, it seemed, had already made that decision for them. As if in direct response to their frantic argument, To the dissonance of their panic, the environment itself began to answer. The faint, crystalline ringing they had been hearing intermittently for 2 days now swelled in volume, rising rapidly from a background hum to a deafening, all-encompassing chime. It was a sound that seemed to emanate not from a single point, but from every single grain of the glassy sand beneath their feet. The entire mountainside had become a colossal, vibrating bell. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic field they had been measuring spiked to an impossible level. All at once, their electronic equipment died. Their headlamps, their only source of light, flickered violently and then went out, plunging them into absolute, terrifying darkness. The short-range radio on Lena's chest harness hissed with a final burst of static and then fell silent. The digital display on Thorne's wrist chronometer flashed a jumble of symbols and went blank. They were cut off, blind, alone on an alien world that was, after eons of slumber, finally waking up. And then, light returned. Not the focused, sterile beam of their flashlights, but a cold, ghostly, phosphorescent glow that began to rise from the sand all around them. It was a spectral blue-green light, faint at first, then growing in intensity, casting the entire landscape in the ethereal luminescence of a deep-sea trench. They could now see the entire mountainside, the other peaks, the starless sky above, and the sight was one of sublime and absolute horror. The light was not static. It was alive. It flowed across the slopes in intricate, geometric patterns, racing like neural pathways firing in a colossal brain. The mountain was thinking, and they were trapped inside its mind. The symphony had begun. Ben had reached his destination. A wide, flat plateau about halfway up the second, taller peak, the epicenter of the signal. He walked to its precise center and stopped, the ghostly light swirling around his feet like a tide. He fell to his knees, his movements no longer human, but ritualistic. He raised his face to the sky, his mouth still open, the alien language still pouring out. Then, he plunged both of his hands deep into the glowing sand. And he screamed. It was a sound that tore through the crystalline chiming, a sound of pure, unadulterated human agony. But it was horribly overlaid with something else, a synthetic, tearing shriek. It was the sound from the old legends, the sound of the star that fell. It was the sound of a human consciousness being flayed, shredded, and overwritten by something immeasurably vast and utterly alien. The ground began to vibrate violently, not the subtle hum from before, but a deep, seismic shudder that threatened to shake them from their feet. The glass sand, no longer inert, began to move. Animated by the pulsing energy field, it flowed with the impossible viscosity of liquid metal. It swirled around Ben's kneeling form, rising up his arms and legs like a black tide, enveloping him, encasing him. "Oh my God," Thorne whispered, the words barely audible. His scientific fascination, his ambition, his lifelong quest for answers, all of it had been burned away, leaving only a core of raw, primal terror. "We have to go," Lena shrieked, the words a raw burst of survival instinct. She grabbed the sleeve of Thorne's parka and pulled, hard. "Eris, run." This time, he did not argue. The spell was broken. They turned and began a desperate, clumsy scramble back down the treacherous slope, their heavy boots slipping and sliding on the shifting, glowing sand. But escape was not that simple. The mountain, the entity that was the mountain, was now fully aware of them. It perceived them as foreign bodies, as contaminants in its awakening consciousness. The sand beneath their feet actively shifted, trying to trip them, the glassy particles flowing to create sudden pits and treacherous drifts. The air itself grew thick, heavy, resonating with the chorus of dissonant, crystalline tones that felt like physical blows against their bodies, making their teeth ache and their vision swim. Against her better judgment, Lena glanced back over her shoulder. The sight would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life. The sand had now completely formed a shimmering, egg-shaped, crystalline cocoon around where Ben had been. The cocoon pulsed with a blinding blue-green light, in time with the deafening chimes. And from the very top of this horrific chrysalis, a spire of pure, solidified light was beginning to rise, twisting as it grew, reaching for the star-dusted sky like an antenna. It was a receiver, or a transmitter. It was the shattered god, using the raw materials of a human body and mind, trying to phone home. Or perhaps, it was simply trying to remember its own name, to pull together one single, coherent thought from the billion scattered fragments of its being. As they scrambled downwards through the chaos, Thorne's foot caught on an unseen ridge. He cried out a sharp, pathetic sound of pain as his leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. A sickening, wet crack echoed for a moment in the cacophony. He fell hard, his face pressing directly into the glowing, flowing sand. "Eris!" Lena screamed, skidding to a halt and turning back for him. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his face a mask of agony. But as Lena watched in horror, the pain in his eyes was replaced by something else. A look of terrifying, newfound clarity. He was no longer struggling. He had gone limp. The spectral, blue-green light of the sand seemed to be flowing into him, his skin taking on the same deathly, phosphorescent glow. "Lena," he gasped, his voice no longer his own. It was soft, filled with a horrific awe. It's beautiful. The patterns, they're not just mathematics. They're art. They're history. A billion years of memory. His voice trailed off. He was no longer looking at Lena, no longer aware of her. His wide, glowing eyes were fixed on the impossible, light-wreathed spire that now dominated the mountainside. His face was filled with a look of ecstatic, horrific understanding. He had spent his entire life demanding answers from the universe, and in his final moments, the universe had given him one. An answer so vast, so profound, so utterly alien, that it was consuming his sanity like a fire-consuming paper. "It's not trying to hurt us," he whispered, a beatific, terrible smile spreading across his face as the black sand began to flow over his legs. "It's just lonely." He stopped trying to get up. He simply lay there, willingly, as the shimmering sand began to gently, lovingly, pull him down into itself, dissolving him, making him one with the mountain's memory. A sob of pure despair tore from Lena's throat. She knew he was lost. She knew they were all lost. There was only one instinct left, flight. She turned and ran. She ran with the desperate, unthinking, animal instinct of a creature trying to escape a predator whose existence it could not comprehend. She ran from the light, from the sound, from the terrible, beautiful, mind-shattering symphony of a shattered star. She did not look back again. She ran until her lungs burned with the fire of oxygen debt and her legs were numb, rubbery things that no longer obeyed her commands. She ran until she tumbled, head over heels, down the final 100 yards of the glassy slope, crashing over the invisible threshold and landing in a bruised heap on the dead, silent, blessedly normal rock of the lower mountain. Behind her, the symphony of light and sound on the vitrified peaks reached a deafening, blinding crescendo that lit up the entire range like a silent atomic bomb. And then, as suddenly as it began, there was silence. And perfect, utter darkness. The universe is not obliged to provide clean endings. It does not operate on the three-act structure of human storytelling. The symphony on the mountain did not end with a resolution. It simply stopped. The echoes of that terrible crescendo, however, would ripple outwards, shaping and shattering lives far down in the quiet valley below. For 2 days, Dr. Lena Petrova lay where she had fallen, just across the threshold of the glass sand. She drifted in and out of a state that was neither consciousness nor sleep, a gray, feverish limbo. Her body was a wreck of dehydration, hypothermia, and deep tissue bruising. But the true damage was not to her flesh. It was to her mind. Her waking moments were filled with the phantom pressure of the crystalline chimes in her skull. Her brief, tortured periods of sleep were haunted by images of a glowing, ecstatic smile on Thorne's face as he was consumed, and by the impossible architecture of the light spire reaching for a silent, alien sky. She was found by Kalen Vance. From his solitary camp at the Treeline, Kale had witnessed the event. He had not seen the details, only the terrifying, silent eruption of blue-green light that had turned the high peaks into a ghostly lantern against the night sky. He did not panic. He did not run. He simply sat, wrapped in a heavy blanket, and watched. He knew, with the ancient certainty of his ancestors, that he was witnessing the mountain dreaming. When the light had died with that impossible abruptness, he did not immediately rush to their aid. The protocol of his people was clear. You do not interfere with the mountain's affairs. You wait. You let the echo fade. He waited 1 full day, letting the mountain settle back into its slumber. Then, at dawn on the 2nd day, he began his ascent. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, his eyes scanning the barren slopes. He found Lena a few 100 yards above the Treeline, a crumpled form against the gray rock. He found no one else. Of Dr. Thorne and Ben Carter, there was no sign. No bodies, no torn equipment, no bloodstains in the sand. The glittering black slopes were pristine, silent, and empty, as if the expedition had never been there at all. They had simply been erased. Kale carried Lena back down to his camp. He treated her frostbite and forced water between her cracked lips. She was in a state of profound psychological shock, muttering disconnected fragments. The pattern so lonely he was smiling. Kale listened without judgment. He had heard variations of these words before, in the stories passed down through generations. When the authorities were finally contacted, the official story began to take shape, crafted with the careful precision of institutional damage control. The university, the Grant Foundation, the local sheriff's department, they all had a vested interest in a narrative that was tragic, but comprehensible. The official report, the one released to the public and filed away in neatly labeled folders, was a masterpiece of plausible fiction. It stated that the Thorne expedition, pushing the limits of their schedule, was caught by a sudden, unseasonal, and unusually violent electrical storm high on the mountain. A massive lightning strike, a singular, powerful bolt was said to have hit the peak, destabilizing the rock face and triggering a catastrophic rock slide. Dr. Thorne and doctoral candidate Ben Carter, it was concluded, were tragically lost in the slide. Their bodies were presumed buried under thousands of tons of rock and scree, making any recovery effort both impossible and far too dangerous to attempt. Dr. Lena Petrova, the sole, fortunate survivor, was found in a state of severe shock and trauma, her memory of the event fragmented and unreliable. It was a neat, clean explanation. It provided a cause, assigned a tragic but natural fate to the missing, and closed the book on the Thorne expedition. It was a lie, of course, A necessary, bureaucratic lie designed to paper over a truth that was too monstrous to acknowledge. Lena Petrova never set foot in a university again. She resigned her post, citing personal health reasons. In the months that followed, she made a few frantic attempts to tell the truth. She spoke to her department head, to a university counselor, to a journalist who specialized in scientific anomalies. She spoke of living sand, of a mimetic contagion, of a shattered, lonely consciousness in the rock, of a symphony of light that consumed her colleagues. Her accounts were met not with belief, but with pity. The diagnosis was always the same: a severe post-traumatic stress response. Survivor's guilt manifesting as complex, vivid hallucinations. Her detailed, scientific descriptions of the event were seen as her traumatized mind attempting to rationalize an incomprehensible tragedy through the lens of her own expertise. In the end, she gave up. She retreated from the world, becoming a recluse in a small, quiet town hundreds of miles from any mountain range. She lives a life haunted by echoes, haunted by the memory of crystalline chimes, haunted by the final, beatific look on Thorne's face as he found the terrible enlightenment he had been seeking his entire life. But most of all, she is haunted by a piece of knowledge, a terrible certainty that isolates her from the rest of humanity, the knowledge that we are not alone in the universe, but that our cosmic neighbors are not the biological creatures of our science fiction. They are something older, stranger, and they are already here, sleeping, broken, in the deep and quiet places of the world. Kalen Vance returned to his cabin in the valley. He never spoke of what he saw or what he suspected. When asked, he would only say that the mountain is a dangerous place. He retreated further into the traditions of his people, becoming not just a keeper of the stories, but a living embodiment of the protocol. He knows what rests on those peaks, not an evil spirit to be vanquished or a monster to be slain, but a broken thing, a thing of immense power and immeasurable loneliness, trapped in an eternal, silent dream of piecing itself back together from the glittering, glassy dust of its own shattered body. The vitrified peaks are quiet once more. On clear days, when the sun is high, you can still see them from the valley floor, glittering with the cold, remote beauty. Official geological maps will tell you that the sparkle is from flecks of mica and quartz embedded in the granite. But those who know the protocol, those who have inherited the wisdom of Kale's ancestors, those who listen to the whispers on the wind, they know better. They know they are looking at the slow, patient, and eternal thoughts of a shattered god, dreaming of the distant stars from which it fell. The account of the Thorne expedition is a sobering one. It serves as perhaps the most extreme example in our files of what happens when scientific curiosity becomes untethered from caution and respect. Dr. Thorne saw the universe as a problem to be solved, a lock to be picked. He never considered that some doors are locked for a very good reason. The Wilderness Protocol is not about superstition or the fear of the unknown. It's about acknowledging the vast, humbling gaps in our understanding. It's about recognizing that there are forces and phenomena in the deep, quiet places of the world that operate on rules we have not yet learned, using a language we cannot yet comprehend. The protocol for an anomaly like the Vitrified Peaks is simple, and it has been proven effective through generations of tragedy and restraint. Observe from a distance. Document what you can. Do not engage. Do not touch. And if you feel it watching you, if you hear it calling your name on the wind, turn around and walk away. Because some things that fall from the sky are not meant to be found. Thank you for joining us for this declassification. The story of the Vitrified Peaks is a reminder that the wilderness holds mysteries deeper than any canyon and older than any human fear. If you believe in the importance of these protocols and wish to be notified of future case file releases, consider subscribing to the channel and activating notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a place that felt wrong? A place with its own unspoken rules? Until next time, stay safe. And always, always respect the wilderness.